So, having covered probably the greatest philosopher of the early Dark Ages, I suppose it remains to say how we got from these barbarians in the West to what we have today. And in doing so, I'm going to look at the three, what I consider to be the heirs of Rome. I'll reveal them one by one. But the first would be these barbarians in the West. Now, after the reign of Justinian, Byzantium reigned in the East. But in the West, there was just the barbarians and the Catholic Church, which was one of the few surviving remnants of Roman authority, which still had some power and a semblance of literacy about it, even though after Justinian, Byzantium was dealing in Greek, and the West was dealing in Latin, or a slightly corrupted form of Latin. Now, while Rome itself had fallen, it still retained something of its majesty, the city itself I'm talking about, and the Church's power consolidated around the most important man in the city. That was the Bishop of Rome, or as he's known today as the Pope, you might be more familiar with. And thanks to several energetic popes such as Innocent I in around 400 AD, and later on Gregory the Great, the Pope basically became the spiritual head of the West and had great power and theoretical supremacy over the West, even though it was the barbarian warlords such as the Lombards in Italy, the Anglo-Saxons in England, and the Franks in France, such as Charles Martel, who had de facto rule over the large kingdoms, which were made up of small towns garrisoned by local lords, the idea being that small towns with high walls were easily defensible against barbarian raiders. Now, all of this kind of changed on Christmas Day 800, when Charles Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, the first emperor in the West for over 300 years. Charlemagne ruled a territory that covered most of modern France, about half of Germany and a bit of Italy, and he was building on the works of his predecessors, Clovis, the King of the Franks, and Charles the Hammer Martel. I love Charles the Hammer Martel. It's a great epithet, isn't it? It makes him sound like a wrestler, like, I don't know, the Ultimate Warrior or something. Anyway, so Clovis was kind of the first in this line of sort of what would go on to become the Carolingian kings, and he conquered most of Roman France after he turned on his Roman superiors. But it was really under Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, as Martel is French for hammer, that the Franks started to become a real force. They began to levy a professional army as opposed to conscripting farmers, and this was due to Charles's foresight that there was a major threat to the south. The Islamic Caliphate was in Spain, or Al-Andalus as the Spanish called it, and they could quite easily have marched north and taken over France and by extension most of the West. So Charles was able to stop this. I mean, part of it was due to his own tactics, such as the tactical retreat, which drew out the enemy, and then they could hit back while they were overconfident. Part of it was due to having a professional army, whereas previously the Muslims had generally just fought conscripted armies of peasants. And another part of this was that the Islamic Caliphate, which had, I'll say more about in a bit, but it had started to grow to an unwieldy size, and pretty soon after its defeat, and the taxes on non-Arabs that started to place stress on its cohesiveness. Pretty soon after the Caliphate's defeat by the Franks, there were some internal revolts, such as the Berber revolt in North Africa, amongst the non-Arabs, that led to the replacement of the ruling dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, with another one. So there was a combination of factors that led to Charles's success, but the upshot was that Charles was able to conquer a large amount of what's now France, and his successor was able to enjoy the fruits of his success and draw the greatest scholars to his and his subsequent successors' court. Now, one of the great scholars of this area of warrior kings was a man known as John the Scot, or Erigena, and he was an Irishman. Now, Ireland, thanks to being quite on the edge of Europe, right in the northwest, had been spared the worst of the barbarian and Viking raids, and here many of the greatest works of art of the Dark Ages, such as the Book of Kells, had been produced, and some knowledge of ancient Greece was preserved. And so it was no surprise really when Erigena was called to the court of the King of France, Charles the Bald. Here he ended up making Irish porridge of the doctrine of predestination. His denunciation, he was called to rebuff a certain argument, and he ended up, in the views of his patrons, making it worse, but it was okay for him because he was one of the few guys who could speak Greek. Now, whereas Boethius kind of was a bestseller in the Middle Ages, Erigena goes forgotten, so he didn't have that much of an impact. Erigena was a Neoplatonist, and similar to Plotinus, he split up the world into the three things you remember: the one, the intellect, and the soul. He made distinctions in the world into creating and uncreated, that's God, the creating and created, the Platonic objects, which includes the human soul, and the uncreating and created, that's the world, and the uncreated and the uncreating, which is God as end. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything particularly original or that useful in this view. It's almost pantheistic in some respects. But for the time it was kind of the cutting edge, and it just goes to show kind of how backward the Dark Ages were, that this sort of stuff was treated as the cutting edge. One of the other things that he did was to translate the works of an Eastern scholar known as Dionysius the Areopagite. Well, Dionysius the Areopagite was meant to have actually been present at the crucifixion, and so, of course, his works carried great authority because of that. But it was subsequently discovered that this was not the case, hence the pseudo. And there are some errors in Dionysius's writings which kind of cast light upon the claims of the papacy later on. For example, one of the claims is that there was an eclipse at the time of Christ's death, but the thing is that it occurred at Passover, so there was a new moon, and if there was a new moon, there couldn't be an eclipse because the moon has to be in a certain place to cover the sun. So it was scientifically impossible. But the discrediting of Dionysius only came out later. Perhaps kind of as a final concluding remark to this sort of new post-Rome West, other than the division between the popes and the warlords, was that when Charlemagne wanted to build his great cathedral at Aachen, he had to import Roman marble from Ravenna because no one had the skill to carve marble in quite the same way as the Romans had.